really love talking about is this power and control wheel, because when we talk to victims that come through our door, a lot of them are trying to put a name to what they have experienced. And so for us, we don't usually talk much about physical violence, because 50% of homicides occur when the first physical altercation happened. And so physical violence is not a good indicator of whether a situation is lethal or even domestic violence. So that's why on the power and control wheel, you see it on the outside. It's the last thing to happen and the only really visible thing of domestic violence. So we have updated the wheel a little bit. So there's versions that say male privilege and versions that say domination. So I always have to give my disclaimer to folks that when I talk about male privilege, I'm not talking about traditional gender roles. I'm talking about gender roles that are imposed on one party by another where they don't agree with them. So having a perpetrator say things, or an abuser say things like, you are my wife, so you will X, Y, and Z. You are a woman, so you can't do X, Y, and Z, right? And so that male privilege comes into the saying, I'm the man of the house and this is how it's going to be. Sometimes we see male privilege also show up in teaching male children to abuse their mother or their sisters as well, and teaching the male children from a young age that they actually have more authority and more autonomy than the female victim, which is usually their mother. And so that's why we keep this on the wheel. I get asked all the time, can there be female privilege? Typically in our society, we don't see a lot of privilege being associated with being a woman, right? And so this doesn't make it onto the wheel because it's not what the majority of victims are experiencing. Emotional abuse, excuse me, can also be the denial, manipulation, and the blaming. So one thing that our victims say when they come to our door is they keep trying to prove what they say has happened. We are an empowerment-based agency and empowerment-based center. We are different than any other service you can go to because we believe you from the second you come in the door. I don't have the burden or responsibility of taking someone's kids away, putting someone in jail, or making a wrong call where somebody could be left, like a vulnerable adult left in that home. So I get to believe everyone who comes to the door. Excuse me. And so what a lot of victims say is, well, this happened. I need to show you the text. I need to show you this picture. And when we say, why do you need to show us? And they'll say, because he always told me nobody would believe me. So we start from there. We start with, let's pull out the power and control wheel. This is why I'm so happy y'all pulled this out. This is literally what we go over with every victim. So great job on whoever put that first slide together. But we ask them to highlight what they have been through in their relationship. Most of our victims highlight every single part of this wheel. So that other one that y'all showed earlier where you had the descriptions underneath, they'll say, oh yeah, he tells me that if I leave him, he'll get custody of the kids and I'll never see my kid again. Oh, yep, he tells me that nobody would believe me. Yep, he is denied even doing these actions. I don't know what it's like for the survivor on the panel, for the judge on the panel, but working with victims, and I myself am a survivor and grew up in a pretty significant domestic violence household with significant child abuse. The worst part about it was being told this didn't happen. So we get victims who say things like, he pushed me down the stairs and then he ran down the stairs and asked if I was okay because I was so clumsy that I tripped. But I know he pushed me, right? So we're having to battle this internal blame, and even that, y'all have heard of gaslighting, right? That crazy making, where they say, you have to believe me, he did this. And we say, well, why don't you think we're going to believe you? And it's always the same. He denied to my face that he just did this. Can you imagine how maddening that is for a victim to be abused and then have that person go, you're crazy, I never did that. And so that's where we start on day one. Some of y'all were super intuitive in that icebreaker and saying that the long-term effects of emotional abuse are almost worse than physical. They produce the same amount of trauma on the brain as physical incidents of domestic violence. Repeated emotional abuse and exposure to that is traumatic. It changes brain chemistry. It changes the chemistry in our bodies, the cortisol levels we're producing, the stress hormone. And so anyone that minimizes and says emotional abuse isn't that bad, it can be just as bad. The threat of violence can be just as bad on the brain and development, especially of children, as actual physical or sexual assault. So there's a lot on this power and control wheel, and I'm happy to explain any of those more. I will say 100% of our victims, and I can confidently say since working in this field since 2009, 100% of the victims I've worked with have expressed isolation was the first piece that came about. Nobody dates someone that hits them on the first date. But it's hard to argue with someone who says, babe, your friends aren't good for you. Maybe you shouldn't be hanging out with them. And you know your mom's no good. She's always been after this, right? And your sister's just jealous of your life, and they slowly isolate them to where the abuser is the only person in their life, sometimes even making them quit their jobs. And then the second thing that we see is that emotional abuse. So it starts small.